pad of these leaders and actually look at what they believe. And what they believe, some of them, is extremely disturbing, especially when it comes to Jews. So I write this column, and I'm like pilloried for it by the left. One of the leaders of the Women's March, this woman, Bob Bland, wrote this letter to the New York Times where she calls me, it was amazing. I want to find what it was. Oh, she calls me an apologist for the status quo, racist ideology, and the white nationalist patriarchy.
Because you responded to someone
because
who
I
said the greatest of all time
is a man who calls
Jewish
Judaism
termites.
Who calls Jews termites, who calls Judaism a gutter religion, who says that we should burn in ovens, and who, by the way, is a misogynist homophobe. Also, the leaders of the Women's March are associating with this guy and had the Nation of Islam security protecting them. I mean, this is like the most sort of retrograde hate group. And yet for calling them out, I was called all of these things.
Why do you think that flies?
It's a deep question. I think that part of it is the fact that in intersectional left-wing politics, Jews have been whitewashed. Jews are viewed as sort of the white privileged power and part of the white patriarchy, unless they genuflect and say, actually, no, we abhor our privilege and all of the other things that you're supposed to say.
And there's
a
no
blindness to the fact,
right?
And there's a blindness to the fact that, first of all, not all Jews are white. Half of the Jews in the state of Israel, for example, are Arab and from Arab countries that they were kicked out of in 1948. I mean, the idea that Jews are white is this canard. Although I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, my family's from Eastern Europe. I have white skin, but I don't think of, and I have white privilege, but I don't think of myself as a white person. I think of myself as a Jew first and foremost. So it's a complicated identity. But I think that it's sort of it's whitewashed by these people. And I think that anti-Semitism just isn't taken seriously and doesn't rate because people perceive Jews as having privilege and power in this country, which largely they do. But the fact is that the actual statistics show that more hate crimes were committed against Jews in the past year than any other minority group. The FBI is like sounding the alarm every other day in Crown Heights and in other parts of Brooklyn. Random Jews who look Jewish, right, who are Hasidic Jews, are just beaten up for being Jewish. And yet everyone's ignoring that because they're the imperfect victim.
Well, they're also very isolated. They have their own tribe. They stick with them. They look different. They dress different.
Sure, but imagine if any other minority group, we're outraged when we see, at least I am, and you are, when we see a police officer assaulting someone,
What I'm saying is that
a young black person.
They don't make a big deal to go into the public about it. They keep it almost insulated inside their environment and their community. There's also, what I was going to say is, these people that you do hear saying anti-Semitic things, they're equating American Jews living in America with the policies of Israel and what Israel's doing with Palestine. And that somehow, if you're an American Jew, even if you're not even political, you're somehow or another complicit with atrocities that are going on between the Jewish people and the Palestinians. Or
right.
Conflict, any kind of conflict. And this makes it reinforces their idea about you being a part of this white privileged group.
Yes, but they also strawman it and say criticism of Israel isn't anti-Semitic.
Yes.
No one's saying that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I criticize Israel all the time. But there's an obsession on the state of Israel. Like if you were an alien that landed from outer space, you would think that the greatest oppressor in the world is this tiny state that's the size of New Jersey. These people say nothing about generally about the genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China. They say nothing about any number
I'm not even aware of that.
Oh, there's a genocide going on carried out by the government of China against Uyghur Muslims. They're literally being put into concentration camps.
This is literally the first I've heard of this.
So Uyghur is spelled Uighur.
What is a good thing to read about
The
this?
New York Times. We've reported on it. It's an enormous story, and it's like the fact that that's getting that you don't know about it, and that people obsessively talk about the state of Israel as if it's and by the way, the state of Israel does lots of things wrong, but the idea that it's among the worst human rights tragedies of our time, are you kidding me? It's insanity.
I don't know the reality of what is going on in Gaza. I don't know what is happening with Israel and Palestine. I don't know. So I'm not going to be the person that talks about this. But what I do know... I
can send you some stuff to read.
What I do know from people that have gone there, like Abby Martin, who came back with some pretty horrific stories, I think there's a lot of terrible shit going on. There's a lot of awful violence, and there's a lot of despair on the side of the Palestinians. And I don't know who's to blame for that. But many people blame the Israelis. They blame the Israelis for treating the Palestinians as if they're in this one area of the world that's essentially a large prison.
Well, lots to say about this, but I think one of the main problems that we have in the way that Israel is covered is that if you have a camera lens and you're only looking at a tiny piece of land, right? You're only looking at Israel proper, the West Bank, and Gaza.
Right.
Israel, to some extent, is the Goliath in that situation. But if you zoom out your camera just a little, you see that Israel is literally surrounded on all sides by genocidal regimes, like in the form of Hamas in Gaza, whose charter blames the Jews for fomenting the French revolutions, the Russian revolutions, both world wars, and says that it wants to kill all the Jews. That's the government of Gaza right now. I spoke to a mother who fled Gaza recently, okay, and her family's house was just destroyed. Who was it destroyed by? Hamas, not Israel. You never hear those stories. So I'm just saying it is a very complicated politics, but when you see people obsessively focusing on this one state and the crimes of this one state to the exclusion of actual dictatorships in the world who are killing their own people, you have to be suspicious of that.
You do have to be suspicious. And you do have to be aware of their position in the world surrounded by Arab states. And you do have to realize that they are, they're alone out there.
Yes.
You also, I do wonder, what is the motivation for so many people focusing on Jews? What is it? Like, what do you think it is as a Jewish person? What do you think the motivation for this kind of racism and discrimination against Jews, and why is it tolerated? Why can someone like Louis Farrakhan tweet that the Jews are termites and his Twitter account stays up?
Well, it's the oldest hatred in the world, right? A lot of
it. Is that what it is?
No. You're asking me why is it still with us? It's like the mystery of history.
Right.
Like that is deep. I mean, that is something that goes back to the New Testament. Okay, the Jews were blamed in the book of John and Mark. I mean, we could go to Matthew for the death of Jesus. Their role in that story, at least according to some of the books, is that they convinced the most powerful empire at the time, the Roman Empire, in the form of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, to kill the Son of God. That becomes sort of the template for the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. There's a confusion about what anti-Semitism is, right? It's not just a hate. It's not just like this hate of a group. Racists perceive themselves as punching down against a group that's lesser. Anti-Semites perceive themselves as punching up against this secret cabal of wily operators who secretly control the levers of power. That is the canard of anti-Semitism. And that begins with this group that's able somehow to get the Roman Empire to kill Jesus. Now, the Catholic Church disavows this in 1965, which was, an enormous historical event. But that template is still there. And you see it play out, right, in who led us into the war in Iraq. It was the Jews of the Bush administration. You can see it play itself out all over the place. And right now, in the demonology of contemporary anti-Semitism, Israel has sort of been made into the Jew among the nations. You're not allowed to say anymore, like the old school anti-Semitism, right? Like I grew up in a place where there were some country clubs where Jews couldn't go into them. That, frankly, that's not dangerous. What's dangerous is the kind of anti-Semitism that says, this one state in the world of all of the almost 200 states, that's the one that doesn't have the right to exist. That's the one that should be dismantled. That's actually dangerous to Jewish lives right now.
It is. It's an unusual group in that it is both a religion and a tribe.
Yes. It makes us very hard to understand in the contemporary landscape because we are not just a religion.
There's nothing else like it because most Jews that I know do not practice Judaism. but
right,
they
and
consider
yet they,
themselves Jews.
Yes, because
Yeah.
we were a peoplehood before we were
Yeah.
a religion.
Yeah.
Religion is a very contemporary, modern thing that Jews are sort of slotted into, and it makes us easier to understand. But then our sort of national identity or our peoplehood, our tribalism is left out. And that's
Yeah.
an essential part of who the Jews are.
My friend Ari Shafir, who's a fantastic stand-up comedian, he's a rabid atheist, but he's also very Jewish. And he has a new hour that he's working on right now that he's going to film called Jew.
Really?
And he's an atheist.
Oh, I want to see it.
Yeah, it's great. But he's a perfect example.
But
it is
that's
a
also-
tribe. It's not just a religion.
But it's also because the Jewish religion itself, the emphasis is not on what you believe. The emphasis is on deeds. It almost doesn't matter what you believe. It matters that you follow halakha, which is Jewish law. It matters your deeds. It matters all these things. So it's possible to be a good Jew and not really think about God that much, which is very strange, I understand, to Christian ears.
Right. Or you go full Ben Shapiro, where he's both a good Jew and very much like follows the whole deal. Whereas
He follows the whole
yarmulke,
deal.
the whole deal. Why do you think?
But I think, sorry, can I say one more thing?
Please.
I just find it like kind of astonishing, the blindness to this, because imagine a leader of the Women's March said something like, I think Louis C.K. is the greatest comedian of all time, even though I disavow X, Y, and Z thing that he did. How fast till that person was kicked out of the leadership of the Women's March? It would be like minutes, hours.
think?
Yes. I think there are certain things that get people outraged and other much worse things that do not. And I'm fascinated by why that is.
Do you think that if it was a white person that had this opinion about the Jews, that it would be more scrutinized?
I think that it is much easier to fight anti-Semitism when it comes in the form of Richard Spencer, yes.
Yes.
Because then there's liberal consensus, right?
Yes.
About him.
And
He's
there's also, you have a green light to criticize.
Yeah.
It's very,
It is much
criticizing a
harder
person of color.
exactly. It's much harder when someone like Ilhan Omar, the new freshman senator, the new freshman congresswoman from Minnesota, who's like this incredible American dream story, comes here at 12 years old, refugee from Somalia, wears a hijab, is a mother, is the first woman of color representing Minnesota. Like, obviously, I want to cheer her. That's my reaction to her. And yet she has this tweet that she refused to apologize for, where she says, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the world to the evil doings of Israel. I'm sorry, that's a classically anti-Semitic trope, even if she said it unwittingly. And by this point, she should have known. She should educate herself. So it's much harder to criticize that, but it's an untenable position to say that you can't criticize someone for their ideas because of their identity.
It also seems
It's like a road to nowhere.
If you're going to say that, that is a very vague thing to say. You should be incredibly specific. If you want to say it's evil, you should say what's evil and then open that up to some sort of a discussion or debate.
But
what is evil?
But ascribing
general,
supernatural
right.
evil powers to a
Right.
state is very much recalling classic anti-Semitic canards.
Right.
So I wrote a piece about this today, trying to explain that to people.
Yes, I
because she
saw
went
the
on
piece.
CNN saying, "I don't know how Jewish Americans could be offended by this," which I think is incredible.
Yeah. What do you think, if you want to be objective, step outside of your Jewish identity, what do you think is wrong with how Israel is dealing with the Palestinian situation? Because this is the big criticism of Israel, the only criticism. Really, that's the big one. The big one is Gaza and Palestine. So what do you think they're doing wrong?
Palestine meaning the West Bank.
Yes.
Well, I would say the untenable position that they're in is that they are occupying another people. That is what is going on in the West Bank. And I've been there many times, met with many Palestinians. I've really educated myself on this. The problem is that, and by the way, it's not all of Palestine. All of the West Bank. There's areas A, B, and C. It's a really, we'd have to pull up a map. It's a pretty complicated thing. There are places where it's much more autonomous and the PA is in charge, and it really varies depending on the area. So the big criticism, right, is that they're occupying another people, and that is corrosive to the state of Israel sort of morally, to occupy another people. On the other hand, what happens if they pull out of the West Bank tomorrow, right? I'm for a two-state solution, ultimately ending the occupation. But if I'm real, I have to be honest about what that would look like. Well, what it looked like in Gaza is that now you have a terrorist statelet right at the border, which is ruled by Hamas. It is quite likely that that very same thing could happen in the West Bank. Now, let's say, we actually should pull up a map.
Okay.
Let's say Israel does that. Then, like, the whole of Israel proper is something like, we have to look, 2 miles wide?
There we see it.
We should look at the distance between, like, Tulkarm, or like the end of the West Bank, and Netanya, or Tel Aviv, and you see how small that is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to even conceive of it. If you're in charge of protecting the security of the people who live in places, which, by the way, 10 years ago, the year after high school, when I was living there were suicide bombings blowing up in cafes around the corner from where I lived. Are you going to subject those people to that risk? I mean, that's the actual question facing the government of Israel, which, by the way, I'm extremely critical of. And if I lived in Israel, I'd be voting, center-left in Israel for sure. But that is what they're facing. And then if you zoom out and you pull up a map of all of the countries around it, I just want, look.
That's too old, sorry.
No, it's okay. Actually, the one you were on was good because it showed, if you zoomed out, it had everything. So you have Egypt there, then you have Jordan, which is teetering, then you have Syria, then you have Lebanon, and Hezbollah's on the southern border of Lebanon, which is constantly, so that's the real thing. So when people talk about this fantasy of why can't it just look like America? Why can't there just be a democratic one-state solution? First of all, no one there wants it. They poll people constantly. But the second thing is is that really what that's going to look like if we dismantle the state of Israel? Or is it going to look like enormous bloodshed, the likes of which we see in a lot of these countries surrounding it? Someone once said to me that if you want to know the word for, a Jew without a military, it's the Yazidis. Okay, it's the Yazidis. It's the people, it's the minorities in the Middle East who have been absolutely destroyed and overrun. And this is I don't think when Americans talk about this part of the world, they fully appreciate the sort of absolutely painful and hard decisions and the grappling with violence, really. What happened to Jamal Khashoggi in that Saudi embassy, that's normative for this part of the world. So the fact that Israel has somehow, with all of its flaws, managed to eke out a Western-style liberal democracy, frankly, the only place where you and I would feel happy and comfortable living, why are we never talking about that?
Well, I think it's very difficult for people to find the forum to discuss it the way you just did, and to really lay it out in cold, stark reality. What is the solution? What is the solution? I mean, there
is no magic. The solution right now is to do everything possible to build up the Palestinian economy, for Israel to build relationships. Right now it has a very, very positive relationships with Egypt, which it gave back the Sinai, which it had won in the Six-Day War, I believe, gave it back to Egypt for a cold peace, which it's had. It has a good relationship of all things, who would have thought, with Saudi Arabia because of their common enemy, Iran. I mean, things shift there rapidly. But as for the Palestinians, the solution is to build up the economy, make life better, and support people and movements inside the West Bank that are genuinely nonviolent. And those people exist. It's just, frankly, oftentimes they're murdered by groups like Hamas and their bodies are dragged through the streets. If you're accused of being an Israeli collaborator in the West Bank, you know what happens to you? You're lynched. No one talks about that.
No one does talk about that. Would you be open to discussing this in this sort of a forum with that woman from the Women's March?
Sure.
Do you think she would do something like that?
I don't know. I'd be open to it.
Do you think that people like her have ever had a conversation with someone like you who could lay it out that way?
No, because I think that, first of all, many people who talk about this issue have sort of exported American domestic politics to a foreign region of the world, in a way that this is talked about a lot. It's like the oppressor, the oppressed, the white, the black. No, that's not what's going on. I don't think people understand when they talk about Israeli Jews that half of them are Middle Eastern. Like half of Israeli Jews are Arab. There's no appreciation of that reality. They think that Israel was just founded, to save the remnant of the Jews who weren't destroyed in the Holocaust. And yeah, it helped for those who survived. But then once the state of Israel was established, there was a mass exodus of the Jews from all of the Arab countries where they had been living as second-class citizens, where they were either self-deported because they were living as second-class citizens or they were expelled. Again, that exodus, that deportation, never talked about. I would be happy to talk about this with someone from the Women's March.
What is the response currently? Like what is the current position that most people are taking about that woman and about the Women's March in general because of these things, because of these anti-Semitic statements?
I think a lot of people in the past few weeks, thanks in part to Meghan McCain, had 5 minutes on The View with Tamika Mallory and Bob Landon. She did an amazing job grilling them on this.
Imagine that, The View. The View is what's changed, but it's crazy.
But it's amazing.
Yeah,
I know,
amazing.
but she did an amazing job.
Yeah.
Because frankly, because their image was so powerful in the same way that the image at the Lincoln Memorial was so powerful. Right. Journalists just sort of accepted it and didn't interrogate
kitty cat
them.
Hats, 500,000 people on the streets.
Who doesn't want to
Right.
support that? But
Right.
it's our job to be skeptical and criticize.
Right.
So I think finally a lot of people woke up to it. But again, I wrote that column in August 2017, and it took until now. Everything in that column is the thing people are talking about. There was also an amazing 10,000-word expose in Tablet Magazine, a Jewish online magazine, that did a lot of that work. So I think it did reach a tipping point. The thing that is, I see a lot of my friends on the left who are Jewish grappling with is that they so desperately want to be a part of these movements that they're willing to sort of check their identity at the door in order to gain entry. And my thing is, any progressive movement that's asking you to check your Jewish identity at the door, your full Jewish identity, which is acknowledging that we're not just a faith, but we're a people. We're not just people that have matzo ball soup. We're something bigger than that. That's not a space I want to be a part of. They would never ask that of any other group. Why us?
Well, why? Why do they ask that? That's what the real question is. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, I think a lot of it goes back to what I was saying before, which is this misunderstanding. If you see the world in an intersectional way, okay, not as intersectionality was originally meant to be, but how it functions in the world. It functions as a caste system. And the higher you are on the victim scale, at least on the left, and it's reverse on the right, right? On the right, it's like white cisgendered men are at the top. On the left, they're at the bottom. And the Jews are somewhere close down to there, at least in the way that the left, I mean, this part of the left we're talking about, the fringe, at least for now, perceive the Jews to be.
The woke left.
Yeah. The Jews the Jews don't rate. The Jews don't have a place in that victim scale because they've achieved so much success, because they can pass as white, because of any number of things. And so I think that that's a huge reason for it, which is a huge reason why I think intersectionality is a dead end and why we need to be talking about ideas and not identity, right? Like that is the thing about America that is so amazing. And I know it sounds cheesy, but I really feel it, that makes us so special. We are not a country based on blood and soil. We are a country whose national common identity is based on ascribing to a common set of ideas. That is what we're about. And so any politics that's insisting from the left or the right that no, actually what we are is this warring set of groups competing for scarce resources, absolutely not. To me, those kinds of politics are un-American.